Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Sematary Club. When the Creed family is reunited, Ellie kind of looks at church for a long time, and Lewis watches her looking at church, and he's trying to figure out what she is experiencing. And Ellie finally decides church smells bad and she doesn't want him sleeping with her that night, which is unfortunate because Rachel says that Ellie was very concerned about church the entire trip. She was just very worried that he was going to be dead. So everyone has accepted church because why wouldn't they? You know, it is preposterous to think that a cat would die and then come back to life. So as long as it looks like church and kind of acts like him, it's not questioned. Norma Crandall dies in late January, and poor Judd, he is beside himself, but he is handling things quite well. Quote, Rachel did not want to talk about it at all, and would not allow Lewis to talk to her of it. Page 194. So she's still really scared about death. She doesn't want to think about death. She doesn't want to see the body. She doesn't want to go to the funeral. She doesn't really want Ellie to go, but Lewis asks her if he could take her to the funeral, and she says fine, you know, that might be okay for her. Lewis goes over to see Judd, and he seems to have accepted Norma's death. He's fully aware that she is gone. He doesn't speak in the present tense. He speaks in the past tense, and he's making all these arrangements. He calls the funeral home. He calls the church where he's going to have the service. He calls friends and family, and Lewis is about ready to go home. All of a sudden this image pops into his head. Quote, a grotesque image arose unbidden behind his eyes. Judd pulling Norma's corpse on a pagan litter through the woods, toward the Micmac burying ground beyond the pet cemetery. Page 197. So remember Lewis had asked if any person had been buried there, and Judd freaked out and said no. And now Lewis is thinking, if this man is so bereaved, he might consider taking his wife to the burial ground. We finally hear from Rachel as to why she is so phobic about death and why she reacted so strongly that day when Ellie was crying about church dying and Lewis was at a loss. He did not know why Rachel was coming at him with such fury. And we hear the story of Zelda. She was Rachel's older sister by 2 years. So she died when she was 10. Rachel would have been 8. And she had spinal meningitis, and she just slowly deteriorated in the back room of the Goldman house. Rachel was terrified of what Zelda turned into. She was bitter and hateful because she was trapped in a bed, and she kind of made life difficult for Rachel and her mother. When they would take care of her, she would intentionally do things like wet the bed, and she was just angry. And I could see why. Being bedridden, being a 10-year-old and seeing your sister who is perfectly healthy, you're going to have jealousy, you're going to have all these different types of things. And she had debilitating pain, and she was suffering with bed sores, and it was just not something that a child should go through, and it's not something that another child should have to experience. Rachel's parents decided to go visit some friends, and they went across town, left Rachel alone with Zelda, and Zelda died. Rachel was just traumatized, and when she ran out of the house, she was laughing. Everyone thought she was crying, but she was laughing, and she felt guilty for years and years because in the back of her mind, she just wanted it over. She wanted Zelda to die, and she felt bad about that. Being a child, she couldn't understand that really you should want them out of their misery. And her parents were just not very... Obviously, her parents left her alone with a person who was almost at death's door, and it's just unfathomable at this point to think of someone not having a nurse or not having that child in a hospital or something. You know, leaving a little child in charge of a dying, slightly older child is pretty appalling. So that is Rachel's big secret, and I can't believe that Lewis had never prodded her and she had never given that up. Rachel's been haunted ever since. She's always had nightmares of Zelda. She always thought that Zelda wanted her dead in a way, or if Zelda had some sort of wish and could switch bodies with Rachel, she is certain that Zelda would have taken it, and that just fed into her concern that Zelda's ghost was going to come back and take her revenge on Rachel for having allowed her to die and having lived a full, healthy life. And in the movie, the original movie, Denise Crosby's monologue is very haunting and very memorable. I seem to remember really being impressed with that, even at a young age. Lewis and Gage have a perfect afternoon where Lewis shows Gage how to fly a kite. They're in a field, they're just hanging out, father and son, enjoying this simple activity, and Gage is so interested in the kite, he's very impressed, and just, he is so exuberant, and it fills Lewis with just love and this exhilarating feeling of being alive and being with his kid and having a great life. And then we're told that Gage has less than 2 months to live, which I still think is a great device Stephen King employs, you know, telling us that a character is going to die. You would think that that ruins things, but really it makes it better for me. You know it's coming. You still don't know how or when exactly, but you know it's there, and you know that time is limited, and it kind of gets the anxiety going. You know, you read a situation and you're like, is this it? Is this the time? And because he is such a good writer, I think that it's still meaningful when the character does die, you know. Later that night, when Lewis is putting Gage to bed, he sees Church lurking in the dark closet, and he tries to get Church away, and Church won't. He's kind of like, no, I'm here, I'm staying, what are you going to do about it? Especially knowing that Lewis doesn't like to touch him. Quote, and suddenly, without even thinking, Lewis threw the toy at the cat, not playing, not goofing around. He pegged the toy at the cat as hard as he could, furious at it, and scared of it too, that it should hide here in the darkened closet of his son's room and refuse to leave, as if it had a right to be there. Page 225. So the lurking cat in the closet. I am not one for animal cruelty, but I don't think that Church is a normal animal. So in this instance, yes, you could peg a toy at it. Part 2 is the Micmac Burying Ground, and it starts with a great line. Quote, it's probably wrong to believe there can be any limit to the horror which the human mind can experience. Page 229. I think that's really good, and it's so true. You know, you can have horror after horror, and it can just keep going, and there might not be any relenting, you know. So Gage has died. It spares us the details of Gage's death. I don't know if that was intentional, because Stephen King already thought that he had crossed a line. More than likely it's just one of his storytelling techniques where he fills us in a little bit at a time and doesn't dedicate the entire thing as it's happening. He jumps ahead in time, and then we get some backfill. Steve Masterson is his coworker from the university, and he comes over and he's taking care of Rachel and Ellie, trying to assess how their mental health is, and to get Lewis to engage and comfort them and kind of make them a cohesive, grieving family unit. And Lewis is just, he's lost. Gage is killed by one of the trucks that, you know, run down the highway back and forth all the time. And Lewis had almost grabbed him and pulled him to safety, but he missed by just inches. And so he keeps replaying it, and in his mind, he saves Gage. But then he kind of crashes back down to reality, and he's just beating himself up, and he is despondent and not really, he's very distracted. He's just so deep in his own grief that he's of no help to anyone. And Steve is trying to talk to him about funeral plans, visitation plans, and he realizes that Lewis is not really listening to him. So he stops talking and, quote, "They were standing in the garage, Church's stomping ground, the place where he brought his dead birds and dead rats, the ones that Lewis owned." Page 232. There is a big to-do about once you bury something, the person who buries it is the owner of that thing. Like, Church is now Lewis's cat. He's no longer Ellie's cat. Lewis is the one who brought him back from the dead. Lewis is the one who inherits all of his kills, you know. Anything dead that Church brings is for Lewis, and Lewis has to accept that. It kind of makes me think of, you know, when you want a pet and your parents are like, well, you're going to have to take care of it. Lewis is definitely taking care of it. So the morning viewing, the very first viewing that they have for Gage, which isn't technically a viewing because he is so broken that they have to have a closed casket. Lewis tries to make peace with Rachel's parents. They head toward him and he reaches out to shake hands. They won't. Rachel's mother seems to want to, but then her father kind of pulls the mom away. And, you know, they don't want to let bygones be bygones. It's unimportant to Lewis now at this point that there were problems in the past, and he wants this to be the start of a new relationship with them. And apparently Rachel's dad does not want to have that. Judd is very quiet throughout this whole thing. He stays with Ellie during the viewings. He doesn't really talk much. We don't hear much from Judd at this point. And Rachel has been deemed too incoherent and she's not doing well enough to go to the morning viewing, but she goes to the afternoon viewing. And at the afternoon viewing, Rachel's dad approaches Lewis and says, "I told Rachel that, you know, this is what she gets. This is what she gets for marrying you, for going against her parents' wishes, you know, a lifetime of pain and misery and a dead child." And Lewis is just horrified that he said this to his daughter on the day of her youngest child's visitation. Like, who does that? And apparently her dad had been drinking. Lewis could smell it. But the things that this man says, the things that he says and accuses Lewis of are just horrible, horrible things. And finally Lewis lashes out. He punches him. And they get into a fight. It's actually pretty bad because Rachel's dad starts kicking him. He knocks him to the ground. When he makes his final attempt at a kick in the kidney, I think it was, Lewis grabs the guy's foot with his hands and then pushes back, and he falls into the casket, which is knocked off of the trestles. Luckily, Gage remains inside, but still, how does one clean up a mess like that at a visitation? Quote, "At that moment, Lewis Creed wished he were dead." Page 248. And then immediately after he thinks that, he has this kind of vision, this daydream of Gage wearing Mickey Mouse ears and having fun at Disney World. So that harkens back to that earlier fantasy he had of he was going to go down and be a medic for Disney World and leave his family and his worries behind. And this becomes a little theme. Later that night, Ellie, and Rachel is just, this is like the last straw for her. The fight with her dad and Lewis, she had to be sedated. She's home, she's sleeping, she's not doing well at all. And Lewis goes to check on Ellie. She is carrying around a photo of Gage and herself sledding, and she tells Lewis that she hopes God changes his mind and brings Gage back. And Lewis is saying, well, you know, that's not how it works, but things have already begun working in his brain, and he's remembering what happened with church, and, you know, it's definitely a seed that has been planted, and Ellie was not the thing that planted the seed at first. Lewis starts in hard with the drinking. Church appears, and he starts kind of looking at Church, trying to be objective, trying to tell himself that Church is fine. He is still a cat. He's, you know, he has proof that you could bury something, it could come back, and it would be mostly okay. But another part of his mind is saying, you are not being objective. You are totally rationalizing this. In fact, you are flat out lying to yourself. Church is creepy. Church is weird. You know, people don't notice it because, like we were talking about, if you didn't know that the cat had died, why would you assume that it was a changed cat or a different cat or a dead cat that has come back? You wouldn't assume that. But if you knew about it, you'd think, oh yeah, that's exactly it. So as he's looking at Church, quote, "The thought came so naturally that it surely must have been there all along, simply waiting its time to come forward from the back of his mind. When are you going to do it? When are you going to bury Gage in the annex to the pet cemetery?" Page 253. So Lewis has been thinking about it subconsciously, but he has not allowed himself to fully think about it and fully ask himself that question. Then we hear a knock on the door, and it's Judd, and we're going to get a lot more information about why Lewis should not bury Gage in the pet cemetery. Have a spooky day.